You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
In our podcast last week, we played the opening statement from Doug Kantor in the latest Senate Judiciary hearing on credit card fees. Today, we're going to talk to Doug about that hearing and what it means to you. So joining today is Doug Kantor. He is NACS General Counsel, and he is our Part 2 guest talking about what happened in this hearing that took place in late November. Very long name of this hearing is Breaking the Visa MasterCard Duopoly, Bringing Competition and Lower Fees to the Credit Card System. But, before we dive into the hearing, let's just take a step back. And you've done these hearings before. For those who aren't familiar with congressional hearings, can you kind of walk us through why they happen and what takes place in them and what they generally mean in terms of how legislation gets crafted?
So here we go. There are really two flavors of congressional hearings. One is a legislative hearing, which is specifically meant to give a congressional committee a chance to evaluate a piece of legislation, learn more about it, think about whether they would like to pass it, and that sort of thing. The other is a more general, you might call it informational or investigatory hearing, where Congress is looking to just dive into a particular subject, learn more about it. Maybe it'll inform future legislating, or I guess there's a third bucket really of specifically oversight hearings of federal agencies that you could separate out as its own thing too. This hearing on credit card fees sort of straddles the line a little bit because the committee was looking at a specific piece of legislation, the Credit Card Competition Act, but that piece of legislation is actually in the jurisdiction of a different committee, the Banking Committee. This hearing was in the Judiciary Committee. So as a technical matter, this was just the Judiciary Committee having an informational hearing, looking into it, looking to learn more, get people smarter. So it had some elements of both. But importantly, for all these kinds of hearings, one of the biggest things they do is they raise the profile of an issue. They get members of Congress more informed about it. And it's a way to prepare the Congress for, hey, something might be happening on this topic. So here it is, and get ready.
And the judiciary, the Senate Judiciary, that's chaired by Senator Durbin, right?
Yes, it is.
So he has been a huge champion of swipe fee reform for well more than a decade, and is one of the co-sponsors in the Senate of the Credit Card Competition Act. And of course, it's also been introduced in the House. So his intent, in I assume he's the one who called this hearing, is to raise the profile and get to some sort of action. And being some sort of, this is a massive undertaking. And there were essentially three witnesses that were pro-reform and three witnesses that don't like reform. Talk about how hearings are constructed and who gets called, why do they get called, preparation, anything behind the scenes, not House of Cards like, but, is there anything that you can talk about related to what's behind the scenes as hearings are announced and then take place?
Sure. So it is interesting stuff. It is not House of Cards like, but one thing I would note, it is Senator Durbin as the chairman. He has been the champion for many years, but he has always said, and in fact pointed out at this hearing, it was the hearing that the Judiciary Committee had in 2006 that got him interested in this topic in the first place and led to him becoming a champion of reform in this area. Without that hearing, there might not be a Durbin Amendment on debit cards, and there might not be a Senator Durbin as champion of these issues. So that is significant and is one of the kinds of things that you look to have happen in these hearings. In terms of how they come together, there again are sort of two ways it happens. One is that the majority chairman of the committee decides, hey, we're having this hearing and I want the following witnesses, 2 or 3 people usually. And then they turn to the ranking member, who's usually opposed to whatever position they have, or at least skeptical of it, and say, what witnesses do you want? You get one less than I get. Mm-hmm. And then there's a witness panel and it moves forward. This hearing actually came together in a different way, which is maybe less common, but does happen a fair amount, which is the chairman and ranking member actually agreed on the whole thing. It was a consensus panel. And what they did was they agreed Visa and MasterCard should be witnesses. They were both opposed to the legislation and any reform of credit card fees. They've even opposed studies. Then they agreed on 2 witnesses to be in favor of reform. I was one of those, and they both agreed, hey, a small business owner would be a good second person. And ultimately, Chris Callahan, who has a bookstore in upstate New York, was that. And then, look, Senator Durbin, frankly, wanted a third witness who would be very much in favor of reform. And he suggested some witnesses along those lines, including an academic who would be in favor of reform. Senator Graham said, no, we should have an even and neutral panel, and we should have an academic as the 5th witness who has never taken a position on this before. And the senators then agreed on Roger Alford, who's an antitrust law professor at the University of Notre Dame. And he came to the hearing and was fully and unapologetically supportive of the Credit Card Competition Act. It worked out great for us, but he was quote unquote the neutral witness. I will note one other thing that happened, which was very significant, is before the witness panel spoke, there was an opportunity for members of the Senate to address the committee on this topic. Roger Marshall, who's the co-sponsor with Senator Durbin of the Credit Card Competition Act, took them up on that offer and spoke for 5 minutes and was also very supportive. So senators don't stay and take questions from their colleagues, but he still got his 5 minutes to say what he wanted to say on the topic.
Now, you talked about, let's call them opening statements, for lack of a better word. There were 3, and we talked about them on the show last week. We played yours, and we talked about the bookstore owner who talked about Visa and MasterCard are silent partners in his business, but they're unwelcome. And we also talked about the Notre Dame professor, which is his great line was that swipe fees cost the average American more than pet care, coffee, and alcohol. And if you are petting your dog and drinking an Irish coffee right now, you realize how much that costs. That's quite a bit of money. So you have these opening statements, and they're just each person reads or has a dedicated period of time to freeform for 5 minutes or something like that. And then the questioning starts. Take us through that process for this hearing. And you have your opening statement. If you didn't hear it yet, go back to last week's episode, listen to that, and then come back to this. But so you spoke. This is not your first time that you've been testifying. What's the next step? Is there a friendly question? And how do those questions get doled out? And then how does that relate to this hearing?
So generally the questioning works like this. The chairman goes first and has 5 minutes to say whatever he or she wants and ask questions and get answers all in that 5 minute time. Then the ranking member gets 5 minutes as well. And then it goes back and forth majority party, minority party member, usually in order of when those senators arrive at the hearing. They sort of get, there's both arrival and seniority. And so they decide, how to call on people. And so whether you get a sort of an easy question or a hostile question depends on which member is talking, what their position is vis-a-vis your own position. And frankly, there is a ton of work that goes on behind the scenes where both sides or sometimes multiple interests on a subject go meet with senators or their staffs ahead of time and talk to them about the hearing, talk to them about what they ought to raise at the hearing, try to get them to either ask certain questions or maybe not ask certain questions. So it's really part of a broader set of work and conversation. And then you get to what does the member actually say? And sometimes there are members who will basically read what their staff has written for them and do that. There are some members, and staff are often quite open about this, who they get all the briefing papers, their staff writes things for them, and the member does whatever they want to do and often completely ignores what their staff has written for them. So you never know for sure what's coming next. But I think one of the important things is to have, to be sufficiently prepared and knowledgeable about what you're talking about. And frankly, knowing things that, skills that you would have, for example, in a press interview as well. What are the points I want to return to when I'm in a tough spot? All those sorts of things. And then you take the questions as they come and do your best based on that.
I would love to spend the rest of the time talking about how order is determined by what time you show up. I think that's amazingly fascinating. And I learned something new already today. I just assumed it was seniority. So that's kind of cool. But so you have this in using a sports analogy. It's like before the game, you go through what's the other team going to do, what are their tendencies and all these things, and how are you going to play it out. So questions come at you. How do you play them out? Positive, negative? What beyond the opening statement that we already talked about? What were a couple moments that you felt were places where you, let's just say, landed a blow? Let's use another sports analogy and take it to the ring.
So, yeah, look, I think one of the things you have to keep in mind when you're getting questions from members of Congress is to be as respectful as possible. Many times witnesses make the mistake of being too combative or taking a difficult or negative question and letting that create friction between them and the member of Congress, and forgetting that you are there to try to make friends and convince people to like you and be with you on your specific topic. And so,
yeah, you don't want to win the argument and lose the war.
That's right. So from my perspective, I think it's super important to take every question as a favor. Anytime somebody asks me something, I'm glad they asked me. It gives me a chance to talk about what I want to talk about, even if it's a very, the tone of the question or the substance of the question seem hostile. Great. To me, that's my chance to take on what is a criticism that other people are probably thinking. So one, I think that's very important. In terms of this hearing, I did feel like Senator Grassley gave me a nice opportunity to make a point about just the amount of revenue the credit card industry gets from cards and why that shows that the things that the credit card industry says about rewards being negatively impacted, et cetera, just can't be true because they make so much money anyway. Senator Durbin, by design, gave me, some time with a softball question to make some points. I also thought, and frankly, I can't even remember who was doing the questioning at the time. There was a moment where I was able to point out that while Visa and MasterCard kept talking about how competitive this market was, the Department of Justice had literally just sued them a couple months before and said Visa was paying off competitors not to compete with them. And so I got a chance to interject there. But the truth is, you never know when you'll get a chance to jump in versus when you won't. Some of our greatest champions on the committee, Senators Welch and Hawley, I was hoping to be able to answer some of their questions and get into it and make some more points favorable to us. But both of them got so tied up in beating up on Visa and MasterCard very, very effectively that was great. They just kept running with it. And while sometimes you can, as a witness, interject and ask a senator's permission to throw in a point here or there, I decided in those two instances in particular that I didn't want to interrupt their momentum by doing that. And so they just kept rolling, and I think that was very good.
We have a lobbying effort, and it is NACS has lobbied on this issue for 20 years. We have a lot of other associations that have lobbied on this issue for equally as long. Very capable people that do this regularly. But we also have members that lend their voice and can do something about this to help push it that much further along. What has resonated in Congress when members reach out, whether it's for a fly-in or whether it's sending a letter to Congress? How does that factor in to the whole equation of how legislators look at an issue with the testimony and with what their constituents say?
So members hearing from their constituents is the most important thing in a lobbying effort, bar none. Those of us who are professionals can go see them, get them information, do lots of things to convince them. But there's nothing like them hearing from people they know, care about, or should know back home, telling them how much something matters to them. And one of the biggest reasons why our whole lobbying team here at NACS felt like this hearing was a big win for us was because of the very extensive outreach our industry and others, but ours principally, have done talking to their members of Congress, doing meetings, doing fly-ins. It's clear that made an impact. And frankly, the clearest impact you could see from Senator Tillis of North Carolina, interestingly, who is probably the most committed opponent of ours on this legislation. Even though he's an opponent, he made the biggest news for us by saying at the hearing, hey, Visa and MasterCard, you better do something to solve this and cut a deal, because otherwise you are going to lose and this bill is going to pass. Now, why did he say that? He said that because we have, and our members in North Carolina have been relentless talking to him about all the problems with the way the credit card system is set up today and how they need relief. And while he is an opponent of ours on this topic, he does care about those businesses. And frankly, my eternal gratitude goes out to Gary Harris, who runs the North Carolina Association, and many, many of his members. They have been great. And it's not easy to do those meetings when you know you're meeting with your member of Congress and they disagree with us, but it really paid off when we went to the hearing.
So ultimately, with an issue like this, you have the credit card industry and you have retailers, and two very large groups. For the credit card industry, they would like to see, well, it's too difficult, it's too confusing. Let's just keep it the way it is because things are fine. Let's not mess up things. And the view from retail is pretty clear. I don't need to restate it, but the system is broken. We need competition, and this is something that needs to change. So what's next? We've had this hearing, had some wins with changing some dynamics and the way people think. How might this move forward, and what can retailers do about it?
So what's next is we need to keep the pressure on. We have some momentum out of the hearing, and we're doing a bunch of things to capitalize on that, getting parts of the transcript out to individual offices, pointing them to things like the C-SPAN clip of Josh Hawley's questioning, which now is over 1 million likes and is one of the most viewed C-SPAN clips of all time. So we've got that part of the job to do, and we've got to keep that momentum going from constituents back home talking to their members of Congress and keep ratcheting up the pressure. There's no way to know for certain when a legislative opportunity will arise. We're somewhat dependent on the congressional schedule and when they're passing other bills and how, from a parliamentary point of view, we can attach something to a piece of legislation. So our job is to be ready and kind of have the Congress at a fever pitch, ready to go on this topic, and then take advantage of that window of opportunity when it comes up.
So I didn't have on my bingo card, first off, that questions are asked in order by time you show up. But the second thing, I didn't think we would talk about something from C-SPAN going viral. Can you talk about what exactly that clip was so that people know what they're looking for and they can share it, they can comment on it, they can get inspired that we can do this?
Yeah, so Josh Hawley, and he was the last questioner at the hearing. He went after Visa and MasterCard and pointed out their profit margins, actually asked both Visa and MasterCard their profit margins, and MasterCard testified that their net profit margins were about 50%, and then he turned to Visa and said, "What are yours?" And Bill Sheedy sort of very sheepishly said, "They're higher than MasterCard's." And Hawley expressed outrage at that, and then asked them, how much money was owed by consumers on credit cards that they were getting charged interest on. Neither individual was willing to answer, so he had a chart, and he put up the chart. $1.17 trillion is what Americans owe on credit cards, and then he asked them the rates. Neither of them answered. So Hawley said, "Okay, I'll tell you what the rates are. 28% is the average credit card interest rate." And he went on from there to excoriate them for how much money they're making and for them taking a position at that hearing that having a little more competition would cause their business model to fall apart and credit cards to die. And I think the energy with which he expressed that outrage is great to see, and frankly, just how surgically he took apart their position. So it's his 5 minutes worth, and it is, it's up on TikTok with a C-SPAN clip, and there's just been a lot of people passing it around and commenting on it because it is great to see. Now, he did also not only talk about these fees to merchants and small businesses being a problem, but just he's had a bill for a while now on capping consumer credit card interest rates. And he talked about that a little bit too. And so I think it captured people's imagination in terms of just how much of a problem credit cards can be for the average person.
Yeah, when you talk about 1.7 trillion, that's roughly 10% of the U.S. gross national product. So it is an enormous number. And if you're getting 28% of that, that's a healthy business model. So wrapping up, and not to belabor the point, but somebody, I'm listening out there, what's my next step? Is there an opportunity for me to do something right now or just be ready to do something? What can members do or think about at this moment in time?
Yeah, what I say to NACS members and other merchants in our coalition is if you can just do one thing each day, we will win this easy. And those things can include, hey, just send an email to your member of Congress and say, this bill really matters to me. Hope you pass it. Here's why. It can take 5 minutes to do that. Put in a call to that congressional office. Set up a meeting with your member of Congress, either back home or when you're in Washington. We have another fly-in December 17th, all those sorts of things. Or write a letter to the editor of your local paper. Hey, we need this credit card reform. Tell one of your colleagues, hey, why don't you call the member of Congress? Would you today send an email or write an article? All of those things, the consistency of just one thing a day, that can make a huge difference. And frankly, we can work with our members on any of that. We can help with the article to the local paper. We can help with putting together the email. We can help with talking points for the call, all those sorts of things. That's our job, is to help make it easy for folks to do that. But take 5-10 minutes out of your day each day. If that really happens, it will be like a tsunami hitting Capitol Hill.
So how do they work with you? How do they reach out?
Contact Anna Blum, contact Lena Higazi, Margaret Mannion, any of the folks on our team. Literally any of us will be super, super happy to help with that. And we can get you an email listing out all those things you could do, giving you an easy email template and other things like that to do it yourself, you name it.
So if you go to convenience.org and about us, we list all the staff. There's also under topics, there's government relations. You can find things there. If you can't find it anywhere else, contact me. We'll get you in touch with folks. And let's see if we can do one act every day in December and move this thing forward. And if that doesn't work, let's do one act every day in January. And if that doesn't work, we'll do one in February, and we'll keep moving this thing forward. So thank you, Doug, for joining us once again. It was awesome to see a whole bunch of staff last week when you had your hearing. Was watching on the big screen here, and it was cool to see the support that you had from staff in just watching how this all plays out and just seeing what goes on behind the scenes. When you talk about testimony and you talk about this, and if people don't watch it, it's a fascinating process. So thank you for not only advocating our voice on this issue and working with our members, but also talking about how it works, because when you demystify something, you encourage more people to join you. So really appreciate what you've done on all this, and thanks for joining us again today, Doug.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
And thank you all for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.